I used to think the worst thing in life was to end up all alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is ending up with people who make you feel all alone. Robin Williams. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. Because some of the deepest heartbreak doesn't happen in the silence of solitude. It happens in the noise of togetherness, when you're lying next to someone and still feel utterly invisible. This is for the couple who sits at the dinner table, scrolling on their phones, not speaking. For the person who turns over in bed, back facing the one they love, wondering, why does it feel like I'm the only one here? This is not a rare experience. Feeling alone in a relationship is more common than we think, and more painful than we like to admit. At first, you had long conversations that stretched into the night. You felt heard, you felt seen. But slowly, things changed. The silence crept in. The eye contact faded. The effort disappeared. And now, you're navigating life with someone who feels more like a stranger than a partner. It's confusing. It's lonely. And it hurts more than being alone ever could. So what is this feeling? Why does it happen? And more importantly, what can you do about it? Let's begin with this. Emotional loneliness is different from physical aloneness. You might have someone sitting next to you. You might share a home, a bed, maybe even children. But emotional loneliness is about the absence of connection. It's the experience of being unseen, unheard, and unmet in your emotional needs. It shows up in small ways. You try to talk about your day, and they're distracted. You reach out for affection, and they pull away. You voice a concern, and they shut down. Over time, you stop trying. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight. You start to withhold, not just words, but parts of yourself. Your dreams, your fears, your truth. You shrink. You numb. You pretend everything is fine. But inside there's a quiet ache, a question. Is this what love is supposed to feel like? Relationships aren't just about presence, they're about engagement. There are many reasons this emotional distance creeps in. 1. Avoidant attachment styles, where one partner fears emotional intimacy and unconsciously withdraws. 2. Unresolved past wounds, from childhood or previous relationships, creating walls that block closeness. 3. Life stress, jobs, parenting, finances. Life gets heavy and emotional bandwidth shrinks. 4. Unmet emotional needs, where love languages don't align and one person slowly starves in silence. 5. Communication breakdowns, where patterns of criticism, defensiveness, or stonewalling dominate. Sometimes both partners are hurting, but expressing it in opposite ways. One shuts down, the other reaches out with desperation. Neither gets what they need. What's tragic is not that this happens. What's tragic is that we don't talk about it. We romanticize love, but rarely teach what it means to maintain connection. Being emotionally alone in a relationship is not just sad, it's damaging. It can lead to chronic stress and anxiety, decreased self-worth, sleep disturbances, increased risk of depression, even physical health issues over time. When your nervous system constantly signals disconnection, your body lives in a subtle state of threat. That's why you might feel irritable, exhausted, or like you're always on edge. It's your body telling you, this isn't safe. This isn't love. If you're unsure whether what you're feeling is real, here are a few signs to reflect on. You no longer feel emotionally safe to express your thoughts or feelings. Your partner avoids meaningful conversations. You do not feel prioritized or valued. You experience more criticism than support. You feel more alone with your partner than when you're actually alone. You fantasize about emotional connection elsewhere, not necessarily infidelity, but feeling seen. If you nodded to any of these, know this. You are not broken. You are not needy. You are human. Wanting closeness is not weakness, it's biology. We're wired for connection. It's not clinginess to want to feel loved. So, what now? Let's break it into 3 steps: reflection, communication, clarity. Before anything else, ask yourself, what am I truly feeling? Sadness, anger, or longing? When did I start to feel this way? Have I voiced my needs clearly, or have I suppressed them out of fear? Often we carry unspoken resentment. We hope the other person will just get it. But love doesn't read minds. It reads presence, vulnerability, truth. Sit with your feelings. Journal. Speak with a therapist if possible. The goal isn't to blame, it's to understand. Now comes the hard part: communicating with your partner. But here's the key: express, don't accuse. Say things like, lately I've been feeling disconnected and lonely in our relationship. I want us to feel close again. I miss us. I miss how we used to talk. Can we create space to connect more intentionally? I feel scared to bring this up, but I need to be honest. I feel like I'm slowly disappearing in this relationship. Avoid blaming. Use I statements. Focus on your needs and prepare for discomfort. Your partner may not know how to respond, but silence never solves disconnection. Even if they don't have the answers, starting the conversation is a signal of hope. Sometimes your partner might be willing to meet you halfway. Sometimes they won't. You have to ask yourself, what do I need to feel emotionally safe again? What am I willing to work through? And what is non-negotiable? If nothing changed in 6 months, would I still want to be here? Love without connection is a slow kind of erosion. You deserve more than a warm body and a cold heart. You deserve love that meets you, sees you, and holds you when you're weary. Staying out of fear is not love. Settling out of habit is not love. And if you're the partner who's just now realizing, my person feels alone with me, don't shame yourself. Awareness is a beginning. Ask, have I been emotionally unavailable? Do I shut down when things get hard? Have I stopped showing up in the way they need me to? You don't have to be perfect to be present. Start small. A conversation, a handheld, a check-in. Presence is built in moments, not grand gestures. Some relationships can be revived. With therapy, commitment, and emotional honesty, distance can be bridged. But not all can, or should, be saved. Sometimes walking away is the most loving act, because no one deserves to beg for connection. No one should live in the quiet grief of being emotionally invisible. If this spoke to you, let me say this. You are not crazy. You're not asking for too much. You are asking for what every human being needs: to be seen, to be heard, to be loved in the real, vulnerable, messy ways. Don't gaslight your own loneliness. Don't minimize your pain just because you're not fighting or have it good on paper. Emotional neglect is real, and its scars run deep. But healing begins the moment you stop pretending and start honouring your truth. Robin Williams gave us that haunting line. The worst thing in life is ending up with people who make you feel all alone. He was right. So ask yourself now, am I emotionally alone with someone? And if so, what is my next small step toward reclaiming connection? Or reclaiming myself? If this message resonated with you, don't sit in silence. Leave a comment below. What part of this message hit home for you? Subscribe for more grounded, reflective insights on relationships and emotional healing. You're not alone in this. This is the rational path, where we walk together toward truth, healing, and emotional clarity.